My name is Frank Pasquale, and I'm a professor of law at the University of Maryland. And for today's short talk on things they don't tell you about law and economics, I want to focus on innovation, and particularly on the idea that innovation is good in itself. In a lot of regulatory contexts, and this goes across telecom, finance, internet issues, we often hear that any form of regulation might stifle innovation. And this whole discourse is presumed, or presumes that innovation is a good in itself. But if we look back to work by Baumol, a famous economist who is respected throughout the profession, he wrote a piece in the early 1990s talking about innovation that was productive, unproductive, and destructive. Mainstream law and economics too often tells us that regulation impedes innovation, so that regulation means tough trade-offs. Stability and fairness versus economic gains. And I think that when we consider how we should balance regulation and new business activity, we have to always keep front of mind the fact that innovation can harm people. If we look at some of the derivatives from the financial crisis, that was bad innovation. We look at ways in which people are manipulated online in new ways by large internet companies. This is very unproductive innovation. It can be even addictive in some forms. And when we look at various aspects of the telecom landscape, there are things that are billed as innovation, but which are actually not helping consumers very much. Politics and law structures entrepreneurship. For example, generous corporate bankruptcy laws can encourage reckless lending by banks. Stingy consumer bankruptcy laws do the same. Innovating destruction, such as arms dealers do, is not necessarily a societal gain. Law and economics must incorporate social values. We can deter unproductive and destructive entrepreneurship. All it takes is restructuring the legal order that now rewards them. Now, this literature by Baumol, this is something that you won't hear about in most, or perhaps all, law and economics courses. Even though it was written by one of the leading figures in the field, we just don't hear about it in law schools. What we're trying to do here with the Association for the Promotion of Political Economy and Law, APPEAL, is we're trying to recover some of this lost wisdom from the history of economics. And we believe that if we can bring word to professors in various law schools throughout the United States and also around the world about some of these hidden aspects of economics, environmental economics, health economics, feminist economics, insights from economics that just aren't making it into mainstream casebooks now, we're going to have a much richer account of the role of economics in law and how it should affect policy decisions. So I think when we consider our overall project, one of the most important things that we as law professors can do is we can study law with an eye to the strains of economics that are now in the background, bring them to the foreground, and make sure that we present a truly balanced and inclusive vision of economics for law, rather than one that is just partial or focusing on the same group of people that we hear about over and over again. Thank you.
My name is Jami Modud. I'm a professor of economics at Sarah Lawrence College. I'm going to provide a critical perspective on law and economics in this brief presentation. So, what does law and economics get wrong about market competition? Traditionally, law and economics has as its fundamental premise the view that markets can be made perfectly competitive, which in neoclassical economics is the highest form of competition. And yet, this is a highly unreal view of markets, since no firm actually engages in a competitive battle in this particular view. Further, market competition has always been recognized to be a legalized form of coerced injury. Markets are neither perfectly nor imperfectly competitive because they are fundamentally outcomes of particular bundles of legal rights. So the legal rights to property that ground markets are not uniform, fixed rules to be harmonized as a technical matter in order to bring about good governance and economic development. What's the real role of property rights? Conventional law in economics sees property as a person's relationship to an object, say a piece of land or a car, based on the doctrine of first possession. This is essentially a Robinson Crusoe view, which takes a person's despotic dominion over external things as given. The more accurate legal realist understanding of law, however, conceptualizes property as a social relationship. Thus, property governs relations between persons with respect to things rather than relations of persons to things. It is a bundle of rights determined by the legal framework which is in place. The use of one's property invariably has impacts on other people's property. Law creates property as a bundle of rights or entitlements which determine the damage or costs that use of one's property can inflict on others given the current structure of laws. As a bundle of rights, property ownership at its core entails coercive power struggles. Competition by its very nature is legalized injury, and the law either permits or prohibits such injuries. What does this view of property and competition mean for economic development? Historically, early capitalism was not about perfecting competition or markets, but it was rather about political contests over which destructive effects of newer and cheaper technologies would be protected as property rights in order to promote industrialization. One can see this in real-world competitive behavior between firms with its violent winner-takes-all nature, historically legitimated by the doctrine that some damage gets no compensation because there is no injury. Environmental pollution from industrial activity, long tolerated as a supposed inevitable cost of development, has over the past several decades become a major terrain of battle as countries have sought to restrain what was seen as a basic property right of business to injure. Today, this clearer view of property and contracts tells us that we cannot solve the problem of international development in a technical manner. The free market is very much a regulatory system. Laws focused on enhancing profits for business and investors are by definition regulations, except that this approach to regulation reduces society's coercive power over owners of capital. The legal privilege granted them to accumulate as much wealth as they can in turn give them enhanced coercive power to impede political pressures for reducing poverty and inequality. What is an economic development strategy? Contrary to the law and economics idea that informs the thinking of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, democracy and social justice do not automatically follow from establishing legal rules that promote international trade and development. Instead, as has always been true historically in many contexts, a sensible development strategy which is more egalitarian should focus on reducing the coercive power of capital in order to promote social justice and democracy. This has nothing to do with making markets more or less competitive, but involves changing the bundle of entitlements that undergird current property relations. This is a profoundly challenging political process.
Hi, I'm Martha McCluskey, professor of law and an organizer of Appeal, a group working to transform law and economics. One of the things that law and economics doesn't tell us is that economic rights are vital to solving problems of economic inequality and poverty. Rights to basic human needs like education, healthcare, and housing are generally more effective than discretionary policies of redistributive spending. Conventional law and economics tells us the opposite, that economic rights fail. Why? Because they say all rights have a cost. For example, a universal right to affordable health care will simply mask an inevitable trade-off in public or private spending, such as fewer resources for education or jobs. What that law and economics doesn't tell us is that all costs have a right, an underlying legal right. The tough trade-offs between healthcare and education, for example, are caused by particular laws, not by natural scarcity. Law reforms can rearrange those rights to make trade-offs less tough, to give us better options. And by doing that, law can generate economic growth. It is true that efforts to expand economic human rights tend to confront political resistance, and that can lead to costly challenges. But those costs come from unequal political power, not from inevitable economic trade-offs. We can better resist this political power that makes economic security scarce and unequal by challenging the myth that economic human rights are naturally costly. Further, we need to work to combine strong economic rights with strong support for democratic political rights and support for civil and criminal justice systems that are insulated from unequal economic power. In the U.S., for example, a broad human right to free healthcare doesn't need to come at the price of federal funding for education or jobs. If we also work to undo the barriers to democracy that impose these so-called tough trade-offs. To create better public choices, for example, we could undo legal rules on monetary policy or deficit spending that are designed to keep public funding scarce. Or we could undo recent Supreme Court limits on congressional spending powers. Or we could undo recent court decisions protecting the power to buy elections. Or we could prohibit state suppression of voting rights. Economic rights to basic human needs are no more inherently costly than traditional property rights to land, or the economic right to incorporate a business. Just like those established rights, human rights to economic security can encourage productive gain that benefits society overall. If high-quality healthcare is a universal right, not a costly and confusing trade-off, the competitive energy of individuals, businesses, investors, medical providers could focus instead on improving health and prosperity.
Hello everyone, my name is Raul Carrillo and I am a proud member of Appeal, and I also serve on the board of directors of something called the Modern Money Network, which also talks about law and economics from a very different perspective from what we're used to hearing, and we're a bit of a sister organization to Appeal, as I would say. So I want to talk about a major flaw that I see in the conceptual apparatus of law and economics and how that applies to something that bothers me maybe more than anything else, which is unemployment in this country. What law and economics fails to do is account for the state's role in designing the economy in the first place. Not just governing it, not just coming in on the back end and changing the details, but setting the rules of the game. So when it comes to unemployment, there's no such thing as employment or unemployment outside of a particular legal regime. So when it comes to the labor system, borrowing from neoclassical economists, law and economics will say that there's some level of unemployment that is natural, that exists just out there in the world, in the economy anterior to the state. We know this doesn't make sense from a historical perspective. Heterodox economists have been arguing against this for a long time. This idea that there's, people just freely matching up with labor contracts, and then the government can kind of control this or try to change the level if it puts its finger in, but it usually just tends to distort things. So the United States government, of course, did not invent employment and unemployment. Rather, it inherited what Blackstone would say a legal architecture from the British Empire. And throughout the 18th century, Parliament stripped people of their rights and their land and any access to capital that they might have, and created this class of people that had to work for a living, that had to work for money for a living. Some legal scholars, recognize this, and they hit this on the nose very squarely. Duncan Kennedy, for example, has noted that people may now receive, income outside of labor compensation, but broadly speaking, people are forced and coerced into selling their labor for US dollars. That is the rules of the game. That is how property, contract, and tort law and criminal law that enforces it combine to create a system where people have to work. So when we talk about something like intervention, that doesn't really make any sense. How can you say that there's an intervention by the government when it has removed the conditions of material self-sufficiency so that people have to work in the first place? None of that is natural. There are no ironclad rules that prevent us from transforming the system, from ensuring public employment just as we ensure public education or other kinds of programmatic rights. We can confidently design something like a job guarantee, and that would be no more or less of an intervention than maintaining the status quo. So once we account for systems design, we can confidently say that unemployment is not a problem of private markets, as law and economics will say. It is a problem of public law.
Hello, I am Jedediah Cronky, Professor of Law at FGV Sao Paulo, and I'm here today to discuss another aspect of things they don't tell you about law and economics. I'm going to be talking about employment law, specifically the relationship between job tenure protections and economic growth. Now, today it is taken almost as an article of faith among mainstream labor economics that inhibiting employers' ability to hire and fire workers for any reason is socially undesirable. And this social undesirability derives from a presumption that the free allocation of labor within and between firms increases aggregate productivity. Now, at some level, this is intuitive if you assume that workers are only commodity inputs in production. You assume that the hiring and firing decision is a one-off transaction in time, and you assume that labor markets are meritocratic. A classic use of this flexibilization argument was that France in the 1990s could solve its unemployment problem by rejecting all job tenure protections and adopting wholesale the U.S. system of at-will employment. In the 1990s, the World Bank went as far as penalizing borrowing countries for having employment law protections that were considered to be too high. However, over time, the empirical literature tying this model to reality has grown increasingly contested and murky, and the World Bank has subsequently abandoned this practice. My research has focused on exploring how a citizen's life is impacted by job insecurity over time. The field of hedonics in particular has explored a wide range of psychological dynamics that impact our cognitive ability to make decisions when facing uncertain income streams. And that this state of uncertainty is the state that most frustrates our ability to engage in individual and collective social and financial planning. Substantiating the empirical impact of this disruptive dynamic, for decades, labor sociologists have been studying the effects of job insecurity on any number of individual and social outcomes. We have replicated studies that insecurity leads to poor job performance and suboptimal investments in education and skills training. Going further, depression and suicide are mental outcomes linked to job insecurity, as well as very concrete physical outcomes like cardiovascular health. Now, pause to think about how extensive that causation is. Lower levels of job tenure protections lead to greater levels of heart disease. The next level then is collective. Under conditions of job insecurity, marriage rates decrease, home ownership rates decrease, participation in civic groups decrease, and general levels of political participation decrease. The sum effect of these individual and collective harms explains why no country that has followed an aggressive agenda to reduce job employment protections has been demonstrated to then lead to economic growth. What it does lead to is social and often political unrest. Unfortunately, today, such labor flexibilization policies are again being advanced by regimes across the world as a key to unlocking growth. Especially in a world where full-time, regular employment is already under assault from many sources, the last thing we need is to further weaken employment law protections. In short, income security is an essential part of the foundation for healthy and productive society.